Chapter 3: The Vessel of Analysis. This chapter reviews the previous discussion and then considers aspects of sacred space and ritual process in the context of contemporary depth psychology and psychoanalysis in general, and Jungian analysis in particular. I really do believe that Jungian analysis is one of the preeminent places in our culture today where one can have a truly liminal experience, though certainly, as I've said before, not the only place. Chapter 1 looked at traditional views on the heterogeneity of space and human experience, and especially Eliade's concept and understanding of what it takes to have a truly regenerative space and for real renewal, rebirth, and initiation to occur. Eliade clearly saw the relationship between heterogeneous space and the capacity for rebirth and renewal, but he thought it was something that modern contemporary industrial society could not experience. He thought we could only experience vestiges of sacred space in special situations, like the place where you first fell in love, or some other dear place of your childhood. The very existence of those places, however, means that modern space is not totally homogeneous, because they do carry some numinosity, what we would call an energy load or some libidinal load. Chapter 2 then turned to Victor Turner and the way he built upon Eliade and Arnold van Gennep's work on the rites of passage. Turner agreed with Eliade about the reality of heterogeneous space and its importance for human culture and personality, but he went beyond Eliade by asserting that modern people do have limited experience with it in liminoid space, that is, the fragmented or partial liminality characteristic of contemporary life. Modern people do not, however, experience truly liminal space, according to Turner. We looked at the differences between liminoid space and liminal space. I presented my own view that Turner incorrectly understood what constitutes liminality in the ritual process. With his criteria of society-wide participation for liminality, he believed it could not occur in complex, divided modern society, but I think he put too much emphasis on the nature of the society in question and not enough emphasis on the availability of adequate ritual leadership. Both Eliade and Turner underestimated the importance of the boundary or threshold into sacred space, and especially the stewardship of that boundary by a ritual elder. You can think of sacred space in the context of a magical circle, or a sanctuary, or the precincts of a temple. If that space is not clearly delimited and the boundary kept inviolate, and if it does not have a proper steward who knows when you should enter and when you should leave, and what you should do while you are in there, then it is likely your transformative processes will proceed only with great difficulty, if at all. Without what Jungians call a tight vessel, a sealed alchemical vase that can heat up enough with sufficient intensity for real change to occur, any change will be much more limited. There may be some very serious missteps in the process, and malformations may result. We also saw that even the most expert ritual elders cannot control sacred space. Many scholars have misunderstood ritual process because they noticed that ritual elders in traditional cultures observed their ritual procedures with extremely pedantic care. Modern studying the ritual processes in Hinduism or in various tribal rites are amazed at the care the ritual elders put into doing it just right, or as Eliade would say, doing it just like it was done in the primeval time of the gods. Scholars have often mistakenly assumed from this level of patience that the ritual elders, magicians, really thought they had control of the ritual and control of the sacred space. My own sense of it is that the ritual elders observed these things so carefully, precisely because they knew how fragile transformative space was. They had no illusions about their capacity to control it. In effect, what we would say today is that they knew a lot of things you could do to ruin it, and they knew a lot of things you could do to invoke it, but they would never claim they controlled it. In all my research, I have never seen any empirical indication that these people were arrogant about transformative space. I sense rather a deep humility, even a fear that they might ruin it. The patterning of psychic energy. The Jungian view of the transformation process can be talked about in terms of energetics, the theory of psychic energy, the patterning of psychic energy. Some people argue quite rightly that the individuation process goes on naturally. Jungians are divided on this. Some think that large numbers of people individuate and go through their life cycle without ever hearing the words Jungian analysis or Jungian analysis. Others are so aware of the psyche's tendency to split and the likelihood that needed transformations will not occur that they put less emphasis on ritual, less individuation. That truth is probably somewhere in between. In the Jungian view, the psyche develops as a natural process, a biopsychosocial process. There is a metabolism going on. There is energy flow always going on. When you get to the point where you need an initiation, that is to say, you confront some new life task, your libido may be well to confront that and engage it. And you may be able to move on through the process, given certain developmental achievements in your previous experience. You may be able to do that. Human beings, however, have always realized that some transitions are harder than others. When they encounter the very difficult transitions, whether related to catastrophes or the life cycle, they sense that the individual psyche needs some support in catalyzing and directing the energy, or in other words, in shaping the energy flow through the psyche. Anthony Stevens discussed the biological basis of these ritual processes in his excellent book, Archetypes, A Natural History of the Self. That is the book that Victor Turner used in responding to these issues in his Zygon article, Brain, Body, and Culture. Individuation and ritualization always occur together in some way. The fact that certain individuals may at certain times need less pronounced or less overt and conscious ritualization has misled some of our colleagues into thinking that these individuals were not engaging in ritualization at all. That is probably not true. Anytime you have individuation occurring, you also have ritualization occurring. It would not be easy to argue that you can go through an individuation process without ritualization of some form at some location in some way. The individuation process is itself a ritual process. It may not be called ritual. It may not involve a credentialed professional person, but there is some ritualization occurring. Look at Erik Erikson's work on ritualization for context on that, and D.W. Winnicott in the psychoanalytic literature for the importance of the holding environment in personality development. When someone suggests that a person is initiated by the self, and Jungians agree that all initiation is done by the self, my response is, show me a self that isn't grounded in a social process. I haven't seen one yet. The deep intrapsychic perspective that we operate out of must be contextualized by a sense of biosocial systems and the social world in which an individual is individuating. Ritual process enables us to think about all of that in social context. All therapeutic work invokes the client in three components of submission, containment, and enactment. They are there even though the therapist may not realize it. 1. Submission. These principles can be illustrated in every kind of group therapy, ranging from family therapy to psychodrama, to group psychosynthesis practices, to Gestalt group practices, or what we used to know in the old days as encounter groups, and even more traditional group therapy that is more rule-laden and conventional. In all one of these, the submission is clear. You cannot become a member of a group therapy group unless you are willing to submit to its rules. It is a voluntary submission. Professional psychotherapists have made much about the therapy contract that you must have with a person to do therapy with them. They usually emphasize the contract as an expression of professional ethics in protecting the public from unscrupulous practitioners. This is, of course, important, and we also need to protect the therapist from unreasonable demands on the part of the clients. But no one, as far as I know, has ever talked about the contract in ritual terms. The therapeutic contract in group therapy and in all other forms of therapy is one of the chief means by which submission to the process is attained and a container can be formed. The idea of submitting to a therapeutic process is very important to the success of any therapy. People really get a bee in their bonnet these days if you talk to them about submission. Submission is not a popular value today. Ever since the Enlightenment, when autonomy emerged as a central cultural value, submission has fallen on hard times. It's quite clear to me, however, that there must be a submission to process. Going on a pilgrimage makes a good illustration. People on a religious pilgrimage can relax their ego controls somewhat and give themselves over to the structure of the pilgrimage if they just flow along with the pilgrimage experience. It organizes their lives for them. They're supposed to be here one day and they're the next, and do this ritual the next, and so forth. There was a wonderful 3.5-star movie about this. If it's Tuesday, this must be Belgium. In a similar way, the therapeutic process has its own structure. You can really see that in a group process. Have you ever been in group therapy and noticed all the ritual behavior involved? People do the same thing every session. People like Erving Goffman studied the sociology of interpersonal relations in situations like that and began to think about it as a ritual process. There is some submission to the contract, and in most of these therapies, submission to the therapist. A lot of therapists really hesitate to admit that. They want to present themselves as advocates of autonomy. The fact is, however, when you go into therapy, you perform an act of submission that is very substantial and very dangerous. Just as it was dangerous to go into any liminal space at any time in history, so today it is dangerous going into therapy. Look at the statistics with regard to the abuse of client trust and confidence, and studies of this by the APA. It would not be so dangerous if it did not involve submitting to something. Many casualties of the group encounter movement back in the 60s and early 70s could testify to the dangers of joining groups and submitting to group processes. I have personally seen people treated sadistically in such groups led by incompetent or unscrupulous therapists. Going into therapy is a risky business. Part of this is the risks that people will find out things about you that you do not want them to know, and worse than that, finding out things about yourself that can be painful and humiliating, or so devastating that they lead to a psychotic regression. As for therapists, you cannot separate the quality of the space they provide from their level of competence and character. Only the most naive therapists fail to recognize the incredible power they carry, but unfortunately, there are actually quite a few of those. Analysts are certainly more aware because they have all been in analysis themselves. They are the only therapists who are required to have personal experience with therapy or analysis. Most people do not know this. Analysts know from the personal experience of being analyzed how much power is freely given to the healer at the same time. It is very frightening. People's unwillingness to admit this is usually a shadow thing. It may simply be unconscious so you can abuse it easier without having to feel guilty about anything. If you want to become more conscious about the power you have in your helping role, you should read The Power in the Helping Professions. A lot of things may be confronted in therapy that are simply not manageable otherwise. This is true for many different therapies. One of the fantasies that people have is that life is manageable. That's one of the first things that needs to go, because it represents an inflation of the ego. People, of course, should always cope the best they can, but they should never get into the fantasy that life or therapy is always manageable to them. It simply is not. People in the process of therapy sometimes encounter things that are just too devastating to face alone. Therapies vary on the style of confrontation used. Some therapies are very confrontational, getting people to face things they do not want to face. Even in more gentle and receptive therapies, people will still have to confront things they don't want to face. Jungians are normally very receptive to clients and will not push them further or faster than they feel they need to go. Jungians do not like to rush people. Nonetheless, in my experience, you still get confronted a lot in Jungian analysis by the psyche. We must distinguish, however, between a content the ego can face and one that will produce a psychosis if made conscious. If we listen carefully enough to the psyche, it gives warnings on this. Submission is always a submission to a process. It also means submission to a leader in some way, and submission to a sort of dethronement. In group therapy, for example, you must submit to a certain kind of communitas, a certain kind of equality with the other people in the group. Think about AA groups that really show ritual process in a deep way. To go into an AA group, you have to be willing to go before other people and admit, I'm an alcoholic. You cannot go in there and play Mr. Big Standard Oil Executive, even if you are one. You must submit to a ritual humiliation, but this is not ritual humiliation without purpose. There is no sadistic purpose involved. The purpose of the process is to help you deal directly with your inflation and create the conditions for transformative space. 2. Containment. Containment makes possible the facing of the split-off truth. This is true in all the therapies. The ones where you have the hardest time making a case for it would be behavioral therapies. But if you watch a behavior modification therapist for a while, you see how even it is a ritual process. In containment, this special kind of space opens, and things can be said and felt there that will not be felt anywhere else. We speak about the repressed returning. In traditional terms, we talk about the gods speaking. Sacred instruction, suffering, acceptance of suffering. It is in that container that individual redemptive suffering becomes possible. That which he or she has always needed to suffer but simply could not get the courage up to face. Jung makes it very clear that neurosis results when people are unwilling to suffer that which life requires them to suffer. The container gives you a place where you can feel sufficiently held, in Winnicott's terms, so you can let yourself suffer whatever it is that is timely and appropriate for you to suffer, or what you have tried to postpone, but could not stand without the containment. Human beings can stand a lot, but what they often cannot stand without help is this kind of suffering that is required at critical points in life. They need an environment to hold on, like a mother holds a child, so the container in some ways is an archetypal mother. It is a womb. The prototype or archetype for effective ritual leadership is a good enough mother, as Winnicott says, with her infant. By that, Winnicott means a person who is attuned to the organism of the other person, and doesn't intrude where intrusion is not desired, and yet is not absent when absence is not desired. We must note that children are often mistakenly protected from the necessary suffering and struggles that they must face at various stages. One must have what the Cohoutians call optimal frustration for growth to occur. The good enough mother allows that optimal frustration, while the pampering mother does not, thus leaving the child uninitiated into some realities of life that the child needs to be initiated into in early childhood. The holding environment is an image for that containing environment. You cannot be inside the pressure cooker and outside of it at the same time. I don't know how you can get inside a pressure cooker and turn it on and then turn it off before it blows up. I'm really serious. It doesn't mean you can't go through individuation. Some people can make progress through some situations without having to be cooked at 450 degrees. It probably has to do with their strong constitutions and more optimal early childhood experiences. The better the object relations in your early childhood experiences, the easier it will be for your libido to shift at appropriate places in the rest of your life without massive intervention. If you are like me and you had some problems with your early object relations, then it is harder to get that libido to shift without the temperature being higher in your container and a higher pressure at certain pressure points. In any case, you cannot heat it up very high by yourself. People who must really be hot to cook and to change will definitely need the help of an experienced person. People who are really well put together with optimally regulated biochemistry, who had this great mother and father and home with optimal frustration, whose mother was good enough and who made it through the reproachment subphase on schedule and all that sort of thing, might not need the heat turned up to high, and ordinary interactions might get them through these things. Increasingly, I doubt that, but I always say that the exception is possible. I don't see too many people like that anywhere. I mostly see people who are aborted, uncooked, and unfinished, who will not be able to make it through life optimally without a good container for the transformative process. Audience member: is marriage considered a good container for these processes? More. Marriage cannot do it all. That is why marriage is such a disaster area these days. People are expecting that sort of thing from these marriages. They look to the spouse for transformation. Why is my life not better? Well, obviously it's you, it's your fault. Some people may be able to individuate without a vessel that has tight containment and high pressure heat. And marriage is certainly a context for the individuation process. Nobody will deny that. But it is often a failed initiation and individuation process. Very few people are mature enough to hold a spouse in that way, in the way that Winnicott talks about holding. A key thing about parenting is the way parents can get so many of their own needs met at an instinctual level when things go well between them and the baby. Later in life, however, it becomes more difficult, especially for parents who must continue to attend to the needs of their children until they are 35 years old and finally out of graduate school. Few parents can avoid letting their own frustrated narcissistic needs cause retaliation against the child. Good enough parents, however, and good enough therapists can do this. Good enough spouses, usually not. I don't think they should have to try. Perhaps there will be a lot of those kinds of marriages when we all get more mature and the eschatological kingdom arrives. Meanwhile, however, it is really dangerous to expect a spouse to be your holding environment in this sense. Partner and fellow traveler, yes. Container and ritual elder, no. Yet that is what many people long for in their marriage, and so they project their mother and father complexes on each other. Once you turn your partner into your therapist or parent, you obviously restrict them from being who they are. What are we looking for in that? We are looking for somebody to initiate us, help us grow up. That is what parents and therapists are for. The need for it is undoubtedly present, but it doesn't work out too well when we expect spouses to supply it. 3. Enactment. Enactment is just a word for what I call practicing. Enactment means trying on new images, self, other images, and world images without having to take all the consequences for them, as you would in structured everyday life. Liminal space lets you try on all sorts of new things in a playful mode. It may not feel playful to you when you do it, but it is a kind of play. Ludic behavior. You have loosened up the surface and controls of your ego. You have begun to sit a little looser with all these ideas you have had about yourself. You really thought you were one thing, but now you realize, wow, that may not be true at all. So you sit a little looser to it, and when you try on other possible personas and self-images, images of parents, images of women and men, images of sex, images of the world, and so forth, you do not have to commit to any of them, for no external authority is pressing upon you. It has to feel right to you. Enactment refers to all of those ways the various therapies let a person enact such experiments. The clearest example is psychodrama. If you really want to see this in a big way and you haven't ever been involved in psychodrama, I recommend that you try some. Also, family sculpting, which is sculpting your family system, is extremely revelatory to you when you do it. Then you can rearrange it and play with how it might have been if you, an ex-parent, were not so triangulated in that way. What your life might have been like if the early family setting had been structured differently. There are many people conducting psychodrama sessions, and there is even a psychodrama association. Family therapy groups do it a lot, as do the Adlerians. Psychosynthesists also use a lot of psychodrama techniques. They don't call it that, but that's what it is. It comes up in practically any kind of therapy. Even behavioral therapy uses enactments. You practice things. I know of one young man who was shy and easily embarrassed. His behavioral therapist gave him a basketball and had him dribble the basketball all over the loop during the day. That is known as systemic desensitization, but it is also a form of enactment and ritual humiliation. It also worked. He wasn't nearly as shy after the experience. All therapies have this enactment dimension. Anything new you try has an enactment quality to it, whether new ways of looking at yourself or new ways of acting. You don't have to get married to it. Sometimes we talk about strengthening the ego. Whatever technical jargon your particular system uses, it still means experimenting with new behaviors and new ways of thinking and new ways of imaging. You have a container serving as a stand-in for ego structure, because your old solid feeling ego structure has been stripped away. Your ego doesn't feel very solid and you can't stand on it. You use the container while you experiment. Consider the image of St. Peter trying to walk on the water. That is a good image for a liminal state. Unless you are a master of both worlds, you must be in the boat. You must be in the container. Peter was like you and me when we are in a liminal state. Though he heard the call to walk toward Christ, he no longer had enough of that old fisherman ego to sustain him when he left the boat, but he still had not completed his initiation into the new stage of faith. So when he got out there on that water, he started to sink. The stormy water is a wonderful image for liminality. You always need that container, that boat. That's why you must have it. That's the ark, Noah's ark. All these images about being in some vessel during a difficult journey or about the need for containment to allow transformation to occur. Summary. These three principles provide the way for you to be held when your ego structure has been purposely destructured. You must have submission to the transformation process. No submission, no destructuring, no transformation. They refer to the same thing. So also destructuring without a container gives you chaos, or I should say terror. The process is difficult enough when you have a container. You need someone's hand to hold on to. Without the container, you get dissociation and drowning. Enactment is necessary to grow a new ego adaptation, like a new snakeskin. The old one no longer worked, so you had to shed it. Either you got up the courage to submit and shed it, or you got kicked into submitting by life and shed it. If you got kicked into submitting, you had a mental breakdown and had to be hospitalized, so you feel worse about it, but it will manifest aspects of the same process. These three elements occur in all therapies. I know of no exceptions. Most therapists take it as an insult when you call them ritual eaters because of the classic Freudian negativism about ritual. This is changing a lot now, though not fast enough. The frame in analysis. The Goodhart article on analytical interaction is really about containment. Goodhart is a Jungian analyst in San Francisco. His article discusses the important work of the Freudian analyst Robert Langs, who emphasized the importance of what he called the frame in analysis. This is simply another word for the boundary and constitution of the container. He puts a lot of emphasis on such things as the therapy sessions remaining at the same time and regularity of client payments. These concerns from the point of view of Turner and ritual process obviously relate to appropriate containment, forming a boundary and keeping it secure. Langs argues that if you do not keep the frame, you either get faulty healing processes or none. If the therapist does not keep the boundary, it will not be effective. For example, suppose a client asks you to change the regular time because such and such happened. According to Langs, if you make the change too readily without dealing with it, you may be telling the person unconsciously, I cannot contain you. The therapist may give the client an unconscious message that says, if you let your chaos out, I may not be able to handle it, and it may spill all over everywhere, maybe even destroy me and you. Many of us in the Jungian community who appreciate Langs think that he is too literalistic about how one keeps the boundary. In my experience, a therapist can break almost all of the Langian rules and still achieve very adequate containment of a client. This area needs more study. The whole issue of containment needs to be studied very carefully to discern the various ways different kinds of therapists achieve containment. Nonetheless, the point Langs makes is well taken. You don't have to be a literalist, what I call a fundamentalist Langsian, to see the validity in his point. Any client who feels a lot of chaos with all these terrifying positive and negative feelings that have to be split off must have complete confidence that the therapist can handle it, can stand it, and won't run or be harmed. Goodhart and Langs also described three different kinds of interpersonal fields that exist in therapy. One thing it helps to realize is that no therapist or analyst can ever create healing space on demand. This is not within the control of any therapist or analyst. Analysts can ruin it by virtue of what they are or what they do. They can guarantee that it will not exist by behaving in certain ways, but they cannot by themselves create the secured symbolizing field, a persona restoring field. By contrast, results when you and your analyst engage in something that makes you both feel good or look good. Practically every therapeutic relationship has some of that. Let's not get down to business. We're doing this until we get used to being here together during this crazy time. The second kind of field Goodhart and Langs found in every therapeutic relationship is the complex discharging field. For example, when a client insists on presenting himself as a very immature young man, an unwary analyst may project back his own split-off complex of immature young man. The client provokes the therapist to constellate his own negative father complex, and the therapist in return provokes in the client a constellation of his negative father. The client projects his negative father onto the therapist, and since the therapist also has a negative father complex buried somewhere inside, he responds in like manner. We all know that dance. We shift into being the negative father without even realizing it. We find ourselves getting impatient with the client, wanting to strangle him, wring his neck, kick him in the rear, and say, "Get the hell out of here, kid. You're wasting my time." We don't say it, but we feel it. In this example of a complex discharging field, the client can hardly get better while this dance is going on. The therapist still earns money, but it isn't very pleasant. The client will not get any better, because that is the kind of response he has always received from older men, starting with his father. Every time he gets with an older man, the older man fails to understand him, so he says, "Let's dance, older man. You be the bad daddy and I'll be the rebellious son. Let's see if we can get this one going." The amazing thing is that they do get it going with every man they meet, but nothing ever changes. It's always the same, fired from 14 job because they got into this dance with their boss. Change will not occur until they get a secure boundary and an elder who is a good enough analyst. Not a great analyst, but one who is good enough. one who causes analyzans to catch themselves after the session and say, "That was really a complex. I have to be aware of that next time." Your fantasies about being a perfect therapist will diminish the more you become conscious of these dynamics. Therapists need to get more aware of countertransference and notice when this kind of field is forming. Becoming conscious of it is the first step toward avoiding it and intervening in it properly. Unfortunately, most therapies do not teach their therapists about it. First, they don't require the therapist to be analyzed, so they don't know their own complexes very well. Second, they do not stress the importance of countertransference and transference. They do not teach therapists to be aware when they are becoming one end of the non-healing dance. Goodhart believes many good things can happen during transference in a secured and symbolizing field, but the unconscious kind of destructive transference countertransference dyad is also common and extremely difficult to deal with. It must be emphasized that if you do not get to the secured symbolizing phase, you will not get any deep transformation. You will get repetition compulsion. The secured symbolizing phase has enough of a sense of being held and contained that a sort of playful mode can arise in which the unconscious can really flow and a person can begin to play with their feelings and their images and their fantasies. This differs greatly from the dynamics present in analysis most of the time. Sometimes in therapy or analysis you just flow and more will happen for you in one session than has happened in the 25 previous ones. Not necessarily because the analyst did anything different or the client did anything different. It's something like the spontaneity in Turner's community toss. The conditions are right and it happens. The spirit comes. Deep healing occurs. Jungians talk about this kind of process as a context for the manifestation of the mysterium tremendum. This is the deep soul-relating analysis that Jung talks about in alchemical terms, the sacred marriage, the mysterium conjunctionis. Audience member. The sacred symbolizing field seems to have a participatory exchange so that one helps secure the space, become active and not passive. How would that reconcile with optimal frustration? More. This is different. Secured here means a boundary that's secured. The assumption is that the boundary must be secured, whatever your approach to therapy. Whether you're Freudian and have all the cleanliness fantasies that Freudians have, or whether you're a more free-willing Jungian, you're still clear about the necessity for keeping the boundary. But if that frame, or that boundary as I prefer to call it, is tight, then this kind of thing is possible. Then the analyst can dance consciously and not just frustrate the longings of the analysand. This is not ego psychology here. You can get change through various kinds of ego psychologies, but Lange's is talking about enabling that chaotic core to come up, about getting to the deep chaos in the psyche where the really deep ruins are. Ego psychology cannot heal these deep wounds with its techniques of strengthening the ego or by just learning new behaviors. Jung talks about analysis in various stages, and the last stage is transformation. That is what we're talking about here. The unconscious of the analyst is in the soup too. In fact, it is the facilitation of the adequate emergence of the unconscious material in a context of containment, not the brilliance of interpretation or even the analyst's brilliant conscious awareness of what's going on with the analysand that is healing in that field. What is healing is a healing cauldron through which all this stuff is bubbling up. It's allowed to bubble up and manifest. It's allowed to come out. It's allowed to be manifest, held, and attended to, but not attacked. That is one thing that makes analysis very different from therapy. These depth psychologists allow a lot of this really crazy stuff to come up, be accepted and held. If the analyst does not recoil from it in horror in some counter-transference reaction, thereby doing just what the parents did years ago, the material in the complex transforms without the analyst making interpretation, without even necessarily requiring the understanding of the analyst either. It just transforms because they were there in this healing, cooking cauldron of soup together. The Cahoutians call this process transmuting internalization. It just means the return of the craziness that we could have had transformed when we were children if our parents had not been so frightened by it and given us the message that it had to split off into unconscious because they couldn't handle it. That material can come back, manifest, and change in the process by just being accepted. That is exciting. That is the difference from short-term psychotherapy that is going to make you better able to defend against consciousness of the deep, terrifying materials. A lot of therapies, therefore, exist to help people lie better. Sometimes the denial of deep structural healing seems necessary in terms of triage, that is, for maximizing treatment possibilities. The client may not have the money or the time or the courage to go into analysis. In terms of what is actually happening, there's still a lot of stuff in the soul that needs to come out, manifest, be loved and changed. It will never happen, however, in the context of many of the psychotherapies we have. Some Freudians do this kind of deep healing, and the more they do, the closer they get to a Jungian modality. That is Goodhart's point in this article. Jung's understanding of the deepest healing in analysis has followed this kind of approach all along. This does not disparage any kind of help people can get in any way they can get it. People will need all the help they can get, but the more wounded you are, especially early in your life, then the more materials you have split off from your consciousness, and the more you will fear that you will never find anyone who can hold you and let those materials appear and not be horrified by them. This only underscores the importance of the boundary and the capacity of the analyst to hold it. This is not an easy